Evening everyone, can we, thanks. Evening ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Refugee Law Initiative, welcome to this evening's event, Displacement, War and the Future of Sudan. My name is Dr. Nicholas Maple and I'm a lecturer in refugee studies here. So why are we speaking about Sudan tonight? It may not be in the headlines, but Sudan is currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis, characterised by mass displacement, intensifying conflict, economic meltdown, and inadequate aid for the local population. The latest outbreak of conflict began in April 2023 and quickly spread. There are now warnings of genocide in the western region of Darfur. This compounds an already volatile situation of domestic, political and economic instability in the country. In terms of figures, it's quite hard to comprehend the sheer scale of the displacement, with 14 million people forced to flee their homes since 2023. This includes 4 million people displaced across the border to neighbouring states, and 10 million people displaced within Sudan. This makes over a quarter of the population is now currently displaced, making Sudan the largest displacement crisis in the world. Furthermore, almost 25 million people, more than half the population, are currently in need of humanitarian aid, and famine conditions have been confirmed in a camp in North Darfur that shelters an estimated 400,000 people. Yet global attention predominantly remains elsewhere. So the key idea of today's public event is to draw new attention to this issue. While we will be discussing how the country has reached this point, the key displacement challenges, the long-term impacts on Sudan as a country, and what can be done by countries in the region and beyond to address these issues. To start answering these important questions, we have an excellent panel of expert speakers. I will let our chair for this evening formally introduce them, but we are very grateful for all of them for being here tonight. After hearing from the panel, there will be time for questions and discussions with the audience, which can then be continued over the following tea and coffee in the teaching suite afterwards, which is, well, we'll tell you afterwards, but it's around the corner back to the entrance. Finally, this evening's event is hosted by the Refugee Law Initiative. For those of you unfamiliar with our work, the Refugee Law Initiative is an interdisciplinary academic centre established in 2010 at the School of Advanced Study of the University of London to promote research, teaching and exchange on law, policy and practice in refugee and displacement contexts such as Sudan. We have also co-organised this event with the British Institute of East Africa, which is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and has been conducting and supporting innovative research in the humanities and social sciences across Africa since 1960. And thank you to Rachel, the director of the BIEA, and her team for their support. I will now hand over to our chair for this evening, Dr. Lucy Hovell, who is a senior research associate of the Refugee Law Initiative, a partner of Expectation State, and has spent the past 23 years working on issues of forced displacement and conflict on the African continent. Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks very much, Nick, and just to extend my welcome to you all this evening, thank you very much for coming. It's great to have you. And thank you very much to our wonderful panellists. What we're going to do very simply is I'll introduce them and then we will, I'll ask them a few questions, and then we will allow the audience, you in the audience, to also ask questions nearer the end. So please be thinking about those. So just to introduce, on my right, I have Mr. Redouane Moussa, who is the designated expert on Sudan for the UN Commission for Human Rights. And he's held that position since 2022. Previously, he's held other senior positions at the UN, including with UNHCR and with UNOCHA, and also served as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs for the Tunisian Transitional Government in 2011. He brings a wealth of expertise, including in particular in humanitarian and refugee issues and on protection of civilians in Africa and the Middle East. We're very grateful to have you. And then on my immediate left is Ms. Khulud Hia, who is the founder and director of Confluence Advisory, which is a think and do tank, and it's based in Khartoum. Khulud also hosted and produced Spotlight 249, which was Sudan's first English language political discussion and debate, which was aimed at young Sudanese, in the English language. She has a career spanning the fields of research, aid programming and policy across the Horn of Africa, including Sudan, and is very widely published. She has an MSc in Violence, Conflict and Development from SOAS and an MSc in African Studies from the University of Oxford. And then on my far left, we have Professor characterised, who is the David and Elaine Potter Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies and a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge. He's also founding director of the University of Cambridge's Centre of Governance and Human Rights. He's a fellow and trustee of the Rift Valley Institute and vice president of the British Institute in East Africa. His work focuses on contentious politics in Africa in their global perspective, from explaining failed peace interventions and civil wars to rethinking democratic politics in a digital age, with an impressive lineup of publications to reflect this. He also co-founded the non-profit digital social research organisation Africa's Voices, which is based in Kenya. So you'll see we have a really excellent lineup of people. With no further ado, I think we should get going, and I'm going to ask them an opening question, which is kind of very fundamental, but I think it will help the conversation to get going, which is, why is the situation in Sudan where it is now? And I thought maybe we could start with Sharaf to sort of put that into an historical perspective.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you to Nick and to the Refugee Law Initiative for inviting me here. Obviously, the most pressing and urgent thing about the situation is the humanitarian crisis and what's facing the city's population. But I think to put the question in a perspective, it's useful to think about the political situation and the history of how we got to this situation now. So obviously there's a really complex armed conflict that is going on in Sudan, and it pits the Sudan armed forces against a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces. And to understand really why it's become so intractable and so violent, one needs to sort of think about the fact that this is a fallout between two groups that actually had a stranglehold on the state. And that stranglehold was a result of a coup in 2021. And that coup was against the revolutionary moment and transition that Sudan was in. I'll come back to that in a second. But really what's happened is when a counter-revolution, two groups that are trying to stop the transition to a civilian government and stop the political transformation of the country. When those two sides fall out with each other, having for a while held control of the state, it in a sense becomes a bit of a battle to the end. It's very hard to see how those two sides are going to stop fighting with each other, because in a sense they've come to a view that the country is not big enough for both of them. And that's kind of what precipitated the conflict that started in April of last year. So these two armed forces are very large, very sophisticated, and are very much active fighting forces in lots of senses. And so the thing that perhaps is not as clear to those who are not as familiar with Sudan is that both of them were recognized as armed forces of the state. This is not a sort of a rebellion against the state. These are both armed forces that were recognized and constitutionally enshrined in the state under the former president al-Bashir. Obviously the army has always been there, but the paramilitary force was also part of this state apparatus of security that was created by the former president. And so they've been around for a long time, and the history of them is complicated, but they represent the kind of sophistication of armed forces in terms of their linkages externally and their capacity for fighting that is quite grave and quite serious. But what I want to put into perspective is that this counter-revolution that has led to this war was against the civilian uprising and popular revolution that deposed the president in 2018 and 2019. So there have been a few different things going on in this recent past, and that revolution is one of them. The second was the transition to a civilian government that failed, and the third is this counter-revolution. And I think what's important to put into perspective at the beginning is that the transition to a civilian government failed, and that's a failure of external attempts at peacemaking in these kinds of contexts. But the revolutionary promise and the kind of dynamics of the revolution can't be said to have gone away. So we live in this complex period, as we've seen in other countries around the world, as we're seeing in Syria today, where the dynamics around political change aren't sort of settled and certain. And the kinds of ways in which the civilian population in Sudan was looking for an alternative future haven't gone by the wayside. And yet we're in this grave situation now. And I think that's important to remember, because the transformative moment of 2018 and 2019 that led to the deposal of Omar al-Bashir, who was in power for 30 years in Sudan, the promise that was held in that moment is not something that just goes away because of this counter-revolution and its failure. I want to say that all of that to sort of put the immediate last few years into perspective, but I will just add that the longer history of Sudan has been of these complex relationships between different constituencies in the country, different regions, and the center of power. And what's really shocking about this conflict in many respects, and there are many things that are shocking, is how much that has come to take over the whole country. So for a long time, Sudan's wars were fought in the peripheries in some respects. And the question was about the relationship between peripheral communities as such in the regions, in Darfur, in southern Sudan before, in the center of Sudan, and the center of power. And what made this conflict so much worse, and why it's so much more grave and sort of extensive across the country, is that it came to the center of the country and has really led to a fragmentation of the center of power. And that's perhaps what means the gravity has been so much more enormous because of that. I'll stop there, because I could go on, but I think just to hopefully that gives a sense of the political and historical context of the war that we're seeing, and obviously the impact that it's having.
Thanks so much. Claude, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts.
I think it's, this war is both a culmination of what came before and quite unprecedented. As Rat said, this is a war that has, is being fought in the center as well. Historically, Sudan's, sort of military class has always compartmentalized Sudan's many wars to the periphery. What is now South Sudan, Darfur, two areas, the east, and Khartoum was always inoculated against state violence, save for periodic repressive tactics against protesters. And what I think we have this time around is, Sudan's history is very cyclical. You have a sort of war, peace, peace resolution, peace agreement, period of somewhat peace and then return to war cycle, and you have a coup, revolution, transition cycle. And this time around, we're getting the culmination of those things hitting together at the same time. So we had a revolution in 2018, 2019, a coup in 2021, and war in 2023. And this time around, the war started in Khartoum. Khartoum was hit first, it was hit hardest, and that's why you have state collapse happening in real time. And so this is, sort of crossed the Rubicon in many ways, and there's no one now in Sudan that has not been impacted by this war, which is very different to before. I think some of us who have been, knocking around Sudan for a while will remember sort of the peak of the Darfur conflict, and how if you're in Khartoum, you almost had a sense you're in a different country entirely. That is no longer the case. Even areas where the fighting, the front lines are not necessarily at your doorstep, you can still feel the impact of the war in the inflation, in the insecurity, in the hate speech, in how this war has permeated through every single strata of society, into every single sector, both public and private. So we're dealing with something here that I think will require a whole series of, frankly, new thinking and resets to make right. And I know we're going to speak about how to sort of maybe get ourselves out of this quagmire later. But I think it's worth noting that, I think often we see in the media very little attention on Sudan, but when it's spoken about, it's sort of this story of two generals who, sort of Cain and Abel, brothers in arms before, and now they're sort of fighting each other to the death. And that's not incorrect, it's just incomplete. Behind these two figures are whole constituencies, whole, structures of the security state, interests from the region, and the longer this war continues, the more we start seeing these proxy elements as well. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, Russia, I could go on. Almost all of the countries that Sudan borders, which are 7, have a stake and an interest in this war, which means trying to think of a way out of this war is not just about figuring out what kind of elite deal could be made between the two main principal warring parties. It's much more about actually what kind of accommodation makes sense on a much broader scale. But the way Shiraz said, this is a very complex war, and it is, but it's actually quite simple for me. This is a war against civilians, and this is a counter-revolutionary war intended precisely to, beat the revolutionary spirit out of the people of Sudan. Because if you look at Sudan's history, throughout the various rebellions that have taken place, and there have been many, because the centralized state has always been very predatory, very rapacious, and very violent against the periphery. So we've had many rebellions, we've had many, groups from the peripheries raise up arms against the state, but they have never succeeded in unseating the center. The only power that has had the ability to do this has been revolutionary power. So that is the biggest threat to the military state in Sudan. It's not other armed groups. It is exactly the types of revolution that unseated Aboud in the 60s, Numeri in the 80s, and now Bashir in 2019. There's a real, very palpable, I think, objective here that is very clear from both sides, but also other actors around them, that they need to denigrate and as much as possible, eliminate the power of revolutionary actors, the power of the revolutionary spirit, in order to bring about a longer-term return to full militarized power. And that's going to be very, very difficult to do. They tried to do it with the coup, it didn't work. They're now trying to do it with the war, and it's not working as well either. And so I think, when we're sort of looking at how convoluted and complicated this is, there's so many actors that are engaging in this, both domestic and international, some of whom, we've been speaking about the same names for 20 years, 30 years. But what remains true, I think, is that it is ordinary people that are paying the price for these competitions. It's ordinary people who are paying the price for, the avarice, frankly, from the region, particularly from the Gulf. It is ordinary people in Sudan who are paying the price for the geostrategic sort of reconfiguration that is happening in the region around the Red Sea, around the Horn, around the Sahel, all these 3 sort of big regions that Sudan straddles. And we need to look much more broadly at how Sudan fits into some of these contexts while we're looking at a way out of this conflict.
Thank you so much. And that was quite a good segue to asking you, Mr. Musa, the same question, and particularly thinking about some of the kind of regional and international implications for how we got to where we've got to with Sudan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Concerning the root causes, if I may go back there, one should keep in mind that the miserable conditions that Sudanese are enduring today is not only the result of the conflict that has erupted in April 2023. The history of Sudan since its independence in 1956 has been really tarnished by a number of conflicts, inequalities between regions, marginalization of some communities, political instability, and large number of paramilitary entities, militias. Almost each political party, despite civilian, has its own militia, in addition to the poor performance and the poor governance of the country. Just to give you an example, since independence there have been 36 attempted military coups in Sudan. Only 6 have succeeded, bringing to power Mr. Ibrahim Aboud, Mr. Numeri, Mr. Siwar Dab, all generals and then Mr. Omar al-Bashir, who decided to remain in power for 3 decades, and Mr. al-Burhan, both in 2019 and in 2021. This tense situation has culminated in a number of civil strifes, and then the war in Darfur, and then the autonomy or independence, and finally in the April 23 conflict. Sudan has been on the agenda of the Human Rights Council for 3 decades in a row, despite the fact they claim having signed most of the international treaties related to human rights. The emergency legislation in Sudan gives the military intelligence, the police, or the government now very exorbitant powers. They can put people in prison for no reason, for as much or as long as they want. Up to 15 April 23, we were very optimistic. We all thought that many issues have been settled. There have been wide negotiations at popular level on major issues like transitional justice, like the dismantling of the al-Bashir regime, like the situation in Eastern Sudan. We and the world woke up on 15 April to that all that has collapsed totally, and a very brutal conflict has started. And that's where we are today. And unfortunately, despite many mediation initiatives by the United States, by the UK, by the United States, Saudi Arabia, the African Union, I wouldn't mention the League of Arab States because they haven't done much. If they did anything, all these mediation initiatives have collapsed because of geopolitical interests. Recently, the UK, with the Sierra Leone, has submitted a resolution to the Security Council. It has been adopted by 14 members of the Council, except Russia, which decided to veto it because they want to respect the internal and the national sovereignty of Sudan. As if Sudan has anything kept now today from the so-called national sovereignty. That's where we are.
Thank you very much. It's very salutary, of course. I think we all know that. And I guess having sort of thought about some of the sort of, if you like, some of the context of how we got to this place, I think it would be really good to talk a little bit about the impact that that's had. And I know that's just absolutely enormous, but just to maybe break it down, maybe you could talk a little bit, in the first instance, about the impact on the diaspora. Would be really interesting. And then we'll talk a bit more after that about the impact on, as you said, it's a war on civilians. And I think leading on to that as well.
Let me answer that the other way around, actually. Because I think the impact on civilians in Sudan has been far greater than the impact on diaspora. I think, we can rattle off the numbers very easily. 19 million children out of school, half the country in need of humanitarian aid, 70 to 80% of health facilities out of commission. And those that are still reasonably functioning are, very sort of threadbare. You have 11 million people who have been displaced, 3 million people who are as refugees, mostly in the near abroad with very few protections, some of them without even refugee status, particularly those in Egypt. And I think after a while, our brains find it quite difficult to comprehend such large numbers. But as we all know, of course, behind every single one of those figures is a human being whose life perhaps was not, going as well as it could have, especially because after the 2021 coup, state collapse was already, happening. The governance structures were already fraying. The generals, when they led their coup in October 2021, found very quickly that they couldn't consolidate that coup. And the state apparatus, frankly, bore the brunt of that, and of course, immediately so did people. I mean, you have to remember this is a country where, under the Bashir regime, health and education together received 1% of the national budget, and about 70 to 80% went to military spending. So this is a country that was already teetering on the edge before the coup, and certainly after the coup. And by the time the war came, it was the sort of final nail in the coffin, in a way, for a lot of the infrastructure in Sudan. And people are bearing the brunt of this. The commercial sector has been hit. Everyday trading markets have become extremely unsafe. I'm sure all of us would have heard in the past 24 hours of the bombings by the Sudanese armed forces in Niala. That has become a regular occurrence in parts of Darfur. And Darfur, the Blue Nile, the Kordofans, these are areas that are the productive center of Sudan. Khartoum produces nothing. Khartoum is just a very sort of colonial setup where you get rubber stamped before you get exported for hard currency. But all the production, whether it's animal products, whether it's agriculture, whether it's gold and mining, all of that happens in the periphery. And that's why there's been a constant trail of rebellions and wars fought in the periphery. So the impact has been felt everywhere. And there's no one today who hasn't felt, both in Sudan and those who are outside of the country, and some of them who have been out of the country for decades. There's no one who doesn't feel the strain of this. And I think it's quite difficult really to fully explain the everyday suffering that people have unless you are exposed to it on a daily basis, like many of us, particularly the Sudanese in the room, are. But suffice to say, it is something that I think for a lot of people feels interminable. It's something that for a lot of people feels quite hopeless. It is something that is very, very insecure. So even those who live in areas where the front line isn't, they don't live in the front line. On the front line, they aren't able to set anything up, aren't able to take their school exams, aren't able to get their certificates, they aren't able to apply for jobs, they aren't able to go back to their livelihoods. A lot of Sudan's sort of productive sectors are based in the peripheries. A lot of farmers make up a lot of the workforce in Sudan. The informal sector has been turned into mostly what is a war economy and become increasingly dependent on the new trade dynamics that are set up with the war, particularly cross-border trade, a lot of which has very little protections for people. So there's just not much in terms of stability that people can actually use to try and create a life for themselves. And this makes them extremely dependent on friends and family abroad. If you ask any Sudanese person how many people they are financially providing for right now, it will have tripled from before the war, because of the lack of investment in state capacity, because of the lack of, frankly, disposable income that people have. You have a lot of Sudanese people in the diaspora who've been supporting family members for decades. The number of people that they're supporting, the number of people who just reach out to you if you've met them once or twice, and they happen to have your number, asking you to send them any kind of money, mostly for healthcare, mostly just to live day to day because of the inflation, has gone through the roof. And that's the brunt I think that the diaspora is facing most. There are people, we have to differentiate between different types of diaspora. There are those of us who've lived in the diaspora for quite some time, who have secondary passports, who have some sort of relative stability, some sort of relative sort of security that we can enjoy in our lives. Others don't have this. If you, sort of raised in the Gulf, you may have been born and raised in the Gulf, but you don't have access to nationality, and that puts you in a very difficult position. You have a Sudanese passport that you all of a sudden can't renew very easily. That impacts your mobility, impacts your job prospects, and therefore directly impacts your ability to help people back home. This is a cycle that can't be broken unless there's peace in Sudan. But just briefly before I end, I want to say that the situation for refugees in the near abroad, that is Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, is horrendous. And we are seeing a failure by the international system, both the state-based system like the UN, as well as just bilateral relations with countries like Egypt, which has pretended to be a sort of sisterly country or brotherly country, I believe they call it, to Sudan for decades, and yet has not provided the requisite protections for people as brothers, let alone as internationally mandated by the Refugee Convention. And what we have is people who are being sent back to Sudan, for example, in Egypt, because the Egyptian government sees them effectively as a threat, as as a threat to its ability to maintain its economy in its current downturn. Egypt has a lot of subsidies, and so Sudanese people who are there also enjoy those subsidies, and it becomes very easy to scapegoat people. We've seen this many times, including especially in Europe. But this is happening in countries that ostensibly have a lot of shared history with Sudan, have a lot of shared, sort of families with Sudan, etc. There is no sense that the situation will get better. We're not seeing any signs that the situation for people in Chad, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, where people had to go back into Sudan, there were no protection for them whatsoever. We're not seeing any of that improve. And so when we're thinking about the migration picture, we have to think about, sort of safe access for people. We have to think about making sure that countries abide by refugee laws, or at least refugee norms, and that people in those countries are able to have at least some modicum of protection where they currently have none.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I think just sort of staying on that issue of displacement, Mr. Musa, it'd be really interesting to hear from you both about the sort of kind of refugee context, but also the IDP context as well in Sudan.
I mean, several national leaders, including within the United Nations system, have described the displacement situation in Sudan, or resulting from the Sudan conflict, is the most important displacement crisis on earth today. You have 11 million internally displaced people, of whom 3 million were displaced before 15 April 2023, and 8 million are newly displaced people. 28% of them have been displaced twice, at least twice, if not 3 times. And then you have 3.3 million refugees living in very dire conditions, similar to the IDPs. 1 million in Egypt, and unfortunately, sometimes or some of them are facing some deportation threats because of political affiliation or many other reasons. You have 700,000 in Chad, which is one of, if not the poorest country on earth, 500,000 in South Sudan, and a few hundreds of thousands are scattered between Ethiopia, Kenya, and even in Ethiopia, the people who ended up in the Amhara region are facing security threats because of the internal conflict there. I visited Port Sudan last July, and I met with members of the so-called Sovereignty Council, a number of ministers, the UN, the ICRC, and I visited a small IDP camp nearby in the suburbs of Port Sudan. The living conditions of these people are really inhumane. Imagine, you have 3 latrines for 400 persons. 80% of this camp population do not have the minimum non-food item. That means a mattress, a chair, a cushion to sleep on. They receive food one every 2-3 days. The conditions are really extremely dire in a country which is quite wealthy in terms of agricultural products. The budget requested or required to provide assistance to the internally displaced people is now funded at the level of 60.1%. And we are at the end of the year, nothing left. For the refugee situation or the refugee budget, it is only 30% funded. plus the poor conditions they are living in. In terms of impact, I want to insist, because the list is very long, of the tragedy that the Sudanese have been facing. I want to insist on two major, which I believe are major issues. One, it is repulsing to see the increasing number of sexually abused women, girls, and there is a boy in the 194 cases that we have documented. I'm talking about my team. I'm not talking about cases that have been studied or documented by other UN agencies or the fact-finding mission, international NGOs, national NGOs, etc. It is really repulsing, and I must say that the rapid support forces have become experts in this terrible domain. The other worrying situation is the growing trend of ethnic-based violence. And this is extremely dangerous in a country which is supposed to be rich with the diversity of its cultures, languages, tribes, communities, ethnicities. That is now collapsing and might, if there is no wisdom, it might lead to the total collapse of the state and the total fragmentation of what is now known as Sudan.
Thank you. And obviously the impact on civilians is absolutely enormous. And I think it would be really interesting to understand the some of the systemic issues that lie around that. And maybe Sharif, you could talk a little bit about the sort of geopolitical shifts, if you like, that have taken place over the last 1, 2, 3 years, particularly in light of what you were saying originally about this is not just a war within Sudan, it's very much an international war, let alone a regional war. So it'd be interesting to hear what you think that the impact has been on that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to just add one thing as well. Halud said at the beginning that this is a war on civilians, and in not so many ways it has been. But I think one of the things that's really worth pointing out is that hunger is a weapon of war, right? So this is not an incidental symptom of a conflict. It's actually part of the logic of the conflict. And disrupting and damaging productive capacity and markets has been a targeted part of the violence. And that, and I think in some sense displacement, a lot of displacement is also part of the logic of the conflict, not necessarily incidental to it. And that's for a number of reasons, but it also has a long history in Sudan. So this use of hunger as a weapon of war, but then also the management of aid and access as part of the logic of the conflict, as it has a long history. And it relates to undermining the other side and an assumption that there are communities that would ally or support or legitimate one side. And if the community then becomes targeted and the community is undermined, it delegitimates the side that is ostensibly in control of that area or that region. And so it becomes part of the ways of undermining the other armed actor via the community, via civilians. And that plays out on both sides. It's not just really on one side. And so that we've seen that in very extensive ways, especially the deliberate targeting of markets, deliberate targeting of production capacity, of crops, of livestock, etc. And then on the aid and access side, similarly, a real undermining and controlling and squeezing of the ability for aid to come through to the most areas of most need. So one of the things that's really might perplex people is just how much of a control on aid access both sides exert and limit and constrain, partly because it allows them to sort of project authority and control, and where they want, they will seek to sort of benefit from the provision of aid and access where possible. partly as well because of the way that they're relating to civilian populations in ways that are fundamentally undermining livelihoods and well-being. So I add that in there just to sort of get a sense of how much it is a war on civilians, and so many things that we think of symptoms are actually logics within the conflict itself. And going to your question on the geopolitics, I think, as Walid said, Sudan's always sat in a very kind of crucial and unstable wider region. And so whatever's happening in Sudan has had impacts in Central Africa, has impacts in the Horn, and that has always been the case. As a result, there's also a lot of interest from the states immediately surrounding Sudan and what's happening in Sudan. But this conflict is occurring in a very, very new, deeply unstable geopolitical environment. And so everything that we know that's happening in the world in terms of these transitions of power and the sort of shifting geopolitics is playing out very much in the Middle East and in the Horn of Africa, Red Sea region in extreme ways. And so one thing that I think is quite disturbing about that is that the actors who really have, in some sense, leverage and some ability to influence, they're not, the conflict actors in Sudan are not proxies of other actors, but they are heavily sustained and, in some senses, aided and abetted by a range of external actors. So those external actors do have a very important role to play. But those actors now include especially Gulf actors that have much more influence in the region and see Sudan as part of wider dynamics for regional hegemony or influence vis-a-vis each other. So if you think of just Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but as well also Egypt, Iran, these are all countries that have their own vying for political power and influence in the region that's playing out in the Sudan context. So there are specific interests in Sudan, but there's also Sudan playing a role within those dynamics. And that's made it much harder for a range of actors who traditionally would have sought to create pathways towards some kind of peace settlement or some kind of conflict resolution, including European actors, to be able to significantly influence the situation. A lot of the actors involved in the Sudan conflict, right from the time of the revolution that deposed Omar al-Bashir, a lot of the regional actors had no particular interest in a civilian revolution leading to a civilian government. So they were ambivalent around that itself. If you think Saudi Arabia or Egypt, very conscious of the fact that a popular uprising that leads to a civilian government is deeply unsettling in the region. So they were already pitted against the civilian revolution and had an interest in sort of a status quo, rather than an autocratic outcome that would sort of be more familiar. And in the context of the conflict, now having a vested interest on one side or another of the conflict, Egypt being much more aligned to the Sudan armed forces, the United Arab Emirates being more aligned to the Rapid Support Forces, and then an array of different other actors with influence as well. These actors are the ones with leverage. They have no particular interest in a Pacific solution that is around civilian transition. They have interests that aren't just in Sudan, but in terms of their regional politics. And that's making it much more intractable to come out of this in a way that would be recognizable in the past.
Thanks. Yeah, and the intractability is such a recurring theme. And I guess we should also maybe add in the complete failure of the core idea around responsibility sharing, which is so stark in light of what you've been saying, in all of you have been saying, in fact. I'm very aware of time and I want to be able to open it up to questions, but I'm going to ask the panellists one final question if they can, well, this is the hardest question of all really, which is what can be done. But it would be really interesting just to hear each of your reflections on that question, maybe beginning with you, Mr. Nissa, and then we'll open what can be done. It's an easy question.
Please, madam.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It always happens when there's a woman on the panel. We always get the hard questions first. No, it's fine. It's fine. First of all, I think we need to dispense with the idea of African solutions for African problems. The amount of times I've heard that, being sort of bandied about as a way for, frankly, a lot of countries to avoid taking responsibility. This is a global war. This is not a war that is an African by any stretch of the imagination. And so the solutions for it are not going to be found in the African Union, and they're not going to be found in IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, even if this were the same, sort of the IGAD and the African Union of the early 2000s, which was much more seized with, trying to do something, had this great sense of alacrity. Even if that were the case, they would still have to reckon with Gulf actors, Western countries, Russia, etc., whom they can't actually sort of rein in. So given that we have an African Union and an IGAD that is almost at death's door, I don't think we can rely on them to do anything, and that's all we hear, whether it's from Washington or from Whitehall or from Brussels. This is something that should be dealt with, or indeed from New York. With my respect to Mr. Nuesa, the Secretary General, has completely washed his hands of Sudan, and he has deferred entirely the case of Sudan to the African Union and IGAD, which is why we have almost 2 years in, absolutely no movement on a ceasefire, very little movement on the humanitarian path, and very little movement on the political arrangements track. And so what we have right now is a complete paralysis and a stasis within the international system, where nobody knows which direction to move in because nobody wants to upset the Gulf countries. And in the meantime, it is the Sudanese people that are being sacrificed at the altar of this new geostrategic thinking. And the fact that Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia and a lot of countries in the region have been effectively outsourced to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi is now being felt in real time by the people of Sudan. Now, the question, I guess, then becomes, can other countries take responsibility here? Can they actually see that, Sudan had a famine declared on the 1st of August. That's the first famine in almost a decade globally. This is a global level development, and yet very little came out of the UN, very little came out of key bilateral states, and everybody went about his business as usual. Now, I guess the question is, does anybody care enough to do anything about it? We can come up with all sorts of prescriptions as to what should happen for women who are being gang raped, to women who are being sold into slavery, people who are unable to access aid because the United Nations has decided to deal with one of the belligerent parties, the Sudanese armed forces, as the de facto government, therefore effectively hamstringing most of its efforts to gain access. Does the world care enough to really move past some of these very, to me, very simple things to work out, but seem intractable precisely because of the international community's inability to move, or rather unwillingness to move? For me, that's a central question. We could, for example, say that the United Nations needs to be more seized, the UK as a pen holder needs to draft far more resolutions, they need to work much harder at getting the African countries on board so that Russia doesn't veto with the drop of a hat. And we could talk about how the African Union could strive after February, after its elections, to do a lot more to get the Peace and Security Council and the humanitarian and peace and security architecture, which it has been cultivating for decades, to really move ahead with finding a resolution for Sudan. Look about how IGAD could actually go back to its original function and try to stop drought and famine as something that it should ostensibly have a lot of experience in doing. We could talk about all of that, but will it happen? I just don't see, unfortunately, any sense that there is any single country or any single bloc anywhere in the world that is as ready to engage with Sudan as people have been, for example, ready to engage on Ukraine. Sudan is both really important because of where it lies, geostrategically, geographically, politically, but at the same time, absolutely not important enough for actual movement, use of leverage, actual investment. Mr. Nuesa said that a lot of these budgets haven't been funded. They're not likely to be either. And so, we come back to this question, is anyone willing to do anything on Sudan? And to my mind, the answer is no.
Sure. Would you like to ask that?
Yeah, I mean, it is despairing to have to answer this question, and I'm struggling to think of things that are, could tangibly be a form of action that would be meaningful. But I think a couple of things stand out. The first is, on the humanitarian side, and as Walid said, I mean, a famine being declared and the scale of the humanitarian crisis, that has to matter, and it has to matter in the level of at least some kind of recognition and solidarity. I mean, the shocking thing is how little there's even just a sort of a public discourse around the scale of this. I do think the Gulf actors matter tremendously to what is sustaining this conflict. They can't completely control it, they're sustaining it. And it does strike me that there's not been enough effort to think about their sense of self and self-worth and identity, the way they wish to be perceived. And you might recall in the Darfur conflict of the early 2000s, for better or worse, China was a key actor in the situation because of its influence on the oil industry in Sudan, its obviously influence at the Security Council, and it was very self-conscious about its peaceful rise, and it was very self-conscious about how it was being perceived as a big new entrant in Africa. And for better or worse, the coining of the Beijing Olympics in 2008 as the genocide games, this kind of thing did create moral pressure on Beijing to sort of be more responsive to some of the initiatives that it needed to either support, but it was getting in the way of. I don't really like this politics, but this idea that there is a sense of self-worth that is being undermined. And in the context of the Gulf states, they're very, very conscious of being seen as, these places that are modernizing, that are, places of new cultural production, of tourism, of sport sort of hosting, etc. And it's been interesting to see how some of the things that have caught attention have been about humiliation, really, about the sort of political strategy of humiliation. And I think some of that could go much further than it has. So the diplomatic channels aren't working. It's very hard to get London or Washington to put serious, heavy pressure on these countries that it's heavily relying on to invest in their economies in situations of economic kind of vulnerability. But I think publics have a role to play in this, and it's surprising how little kind of movement pressure on Gulf states around sports, around musicians. And I know there are some cases of musicians saying, no, I'm not going to perform in Abu Dhabi because of what the UAE is doing in Sudan, or similar situation like that. I think that is an untapped strategy. It might not be the only, might not be one that works alone. But the other thing I just want to say is, when I began, I was trying to say that there were three things going on in Sudan in the last few years. One is this counter-revolution. The other is this transition to civilian government. And then the third one was the revolutionary kind of civilian revolutionary force. And I think the counter-revolution has failed because these two actors have failed. They failed in there to hold on to the counter-revolution movement. They are delegitimated. This transition in the classic kind of liberal transition to a democratic election being this panacea for all woes in the world, that transition failed. And indeed, the way that it was handled by those who were pushing it helped precipitate the crisis in many respects. But one might think that in a sense the revolutionary sort of moment sort of failed as well, the civilian uprising failed. But I don't think that is the case. And we see that in many ways. One of the ways we see it, and we haven't talked about it so much, is that the resistance committees that formed at very local levels that were so central to the revolutionary moment and sustained that resistance throughout the period after the coup were the front line of resisting the kind of counter-revolution. They are very severely damaged by this war, but they have, in many respects, also transformed and become relevant to the maintaining of solidarity and the maintaining of community self-help, of trying to sort of make sure that there are channels through to the diaspora, etc. And the thinking of the resistance committees and that kind of revolutionary thought has not been extinguished. It doesn't. There's no way that it's simply extinguished because the war is happening. So I think one of the things that really has to be held on to is that the one thing that hasn't failed is actually that revolutionary spirit, and that is the one thing that might hold the country together in the long term. So creating space for that and creating an ability to act in solidarity with that is actually crucial, I think, to the immediate ways in which Sudanese are able to actually withstand this horrific situation, but also to the longer term in terms of holding on to the possibilities of the country coming together around a new dispensation.
Just very briefly, because I realize I was very doom and gloom earlier, which is frankly a reflection of where we are. But there is a bright spot in all of this, and Sharat mentioned part of it just now. The bulk of the humanitarian response right now is being done by local actors, by the emergency response rooms and other mutual aid groups. The bulk of, in fact, the only successful ceasefires that have remotely held have been locally negotiated ceasefires, particularly in parts of Darfur. And the only protection of civilians that is taking place is done by community groups. So I think the lesson here is when the world fails you, you rely on each other. And so these people are actually, showing us this, demonstrating this in real time. And international solidarity is really key on pressure on some of these, bad actors in the region, but it's also really key to elevating the stories of these people, making sure they have their support that they want on their terms. National space, there's a real sort of tendency to try to change some of these ERRs and make them into NGOs, which would of course immediately negate any kind of efficacy that they would have. But we need to look at these structures as a model for doing things differently, as a sort of a counter to the counter-revolution. These groups, by helping people within their community, they are quite literally weaving together the social fabric of Sudan that this war is ripping apart on a daily basis. And so those are the groups we need to focus on. It's not necessarily, what Washington's going to do, particularly for the next 4 years, what Whitehall isn't doing, quite frankly, what Brussels has struggled to do. It's looking at how these groups are doing things in real time and how to support them to keep doing it for as long as they can.
Thank you. And just finally, Mr. Musa, before we turn to the your questions, what can we do?
First, let's summarize the items, the hot items on which we should keep insisting, whether university students and professors, human rights defenders, civil society in general. One is the protection of civilians. It does not make sense to shell or bomb densely populated areas without any prior warning to the people residing there. This phenomenon of sexual violence and abuse should stop, regardless of the perpetrator. The mobilization of civilians, which continues to be done until today. Thousands of young people have been pushed forcibly into these military conflicts. This is one, protection of civilians, and that would require simply the observation of the various international treaties, because even war has its roots. The second issue is access, the humanitarian access and delivery of humanitarian aid. It is extremely complicated. Travel permits, visa for UN staff and NGO staff, or travel permits, the insecurity in many regions. These leaders do not care about the suffering of their own population. The third issue is the respect of the civic space. Thousands of human rights defenders, members of national Sudanese NGOs, and other human rights defenders are today in prison because they just took their courage to say a word against the conflict. And the last point is accountability. Despite these thousands of deaths, despite the suffering of millions of people, there has been no fair, legally based accountability in Sudan. Both parties today claim they have established a committee here, the others established another committee. But when you look at the committee established by Mr. El-Burhani, the Sudanese Armed Forces, they claim to have registered 12,000 cases of abuse. But all these cases have been perpetrated by RSF members. But his army has done nothing. And when you talk to Mr. Hameti, the RSF leader, he will tell you the same thing. We established the committee, but all perpetrators are Sudanese Armed Forces members. This is not fair, this is not partial, and not impartial, and this is lacking the legal basis to function. Now, the international community, as I said earlier, has tried at various levels to mediate between the two parties at least to reach a ceasefire and to sit at the table and negotiate a solution. But all of them, including the sanctions imposed by the US, by the UK, by the European Union, and others, have not worked. They have brought no fruits. But still, the international community, influential actors in particular, should start by sitting themselves together and put a coherent roadmap to put an end to this senseless conflict. The neighboring countries and other countries more afield should stop fueling this conflict by weapons. And I do not understand why the Security Council in 2005 has decided an arms embargo on Darfur, but they have not done it for the whole of Sudan today. The same thing, the International Criminal Court, which has a role, an international role for human rights abuses and other violations. The International Criminal Court has jurisdictions on Darfur, but not on the rest of Sudan. This, I think, is not that difficult to expect. This is, in my opinion, the most burning things on which we should keep looking and advocating.
Thank you very much. I know that was a really hard question, and I really appreciate all of you for what you've said.